Much. There we go.
Thank you so much.
Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, both in the room and online, let's get this parallel session number 5 started, focusing on public governance, democratic leadership, and access to justice. I am going to do just a very short introduction, and then I'm going to get the speakers to share their thoughts with us, the ideas that we have a conversation. And we'll welcome our colleagues online in a moment as well. So I'm Gio Kino. For those of you that's not met me, I'm at the University of Stellenbosch at the law faculty. I'm not going to do long introductions of all our speakers. You've got their details in the program, so let's rather use the time productively. Now, I thought I'll just very quickly frame this particular session entitled Public Governance, Democratic Leadership, and Access to Justice within the context of this gathering on social justice, focusing on restitution. And to me, when I thought about a session under this theme at this conference, there were really two main framing kind of questions that came to mind. The first was really just thinking about the link between democratic governance and leadership on the one hand, and law as the tool in pursuit of social justice, or justice more generally on the other. And it seems to me that there's a tension there, because law is traditionally a conservative source in society. It is mostly about maintaining the social order, which of course aims to protect the status quo. In contrast, in the South African context at least, democratic governance and leadership primarily focuses on change, on shifting us away from the status quo towards a new position. So the first framing question for me really is, how do we bring these two notions together? How do we reconcile people's yearning for access to justice as a means to a better life, not to maintain the status quo, which I think is different from an access to justice perspective in many other societies. Secondly, I thought that focusing on how we frame public decision-making in a way that is not patronizing, even if it is well-intentioned, is an important consideration in seeking restitution. So how do we ensure that people have real access to decision-making that affects them, that they have the real chance to influence public decisions aimed at restoring their dignity? Because in my view, participation, voice, is itself a badge of dignity, of restitution. So restitution cannot only be about bettering people's socioeconomic circumstances. It must definitely be that. But it must also be about restoring their voice, their dignity, as full partners in restitution. Because I was thinking this morning during a lot of the contributions that it is quite clear that people were not only dispossessed of their land and their livelihoods. And as painful as that was probably not the most painful part. It is being dispossessed of voice, of personhood, of inherent dignity. So for me, an important framing question when we think about the topic of public governance, democratic leadership, and access to justice is, how do we ensure that we approach restitution in a way that celebrates, restores dignity as a point of departure and not be patronizing about it? So with that as a very brief introductory comment, let me hand over immediately to Leon Wessels, who's going to start our conversation. Leon, over to you.
Thank you so much. Let me say at the outset that I am of the view that there is no finish line to these matters. There's a famous running shoe advertisement that goes along these lines. There is no finish line to these matters, and they cycle and they recycle themselves. It is struggle, then it's liberation and democratization, and then you become the victim of your own success story, in the sense that As the Chinese would like to refer to it, you solve one problem and that is the beginning of a next problem. On what I've just said, I could get into greater detail in explaining that, but in service of time, I'm not doing that. I'd like to cite just one example, which was it only lasted for a fleeting moment, but it was an extremely exciting moment in my particular life. I was fortunate to have experienced it. And that latches on to everything we're talking about. That is, of course, the moment the South African Constitution was signed. And I fail to understand why it's not properly documented the way I'm putting it now. First of all, people don't acknowledge the importance of the date. The Constitution was signed on the 10th of December, 1996. And that was to celebrate the day there was a vote in the General Assembly of the United Nations about on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Secondly, it was signed in the broader Vereniging area because there is no finish line to these matters. 1902, at that peace treaty agreement was negotiated there. There was no finish line. It was unfinished business. And Mandela insisted that we go back to Vereniging because it was in Vereniging 94 years earlier where we were denied the inclusivity that we then had won, so to speak, through the Constitution. And thirdly, there had to be acknowledgement, and it was in particularly signed in the George Tabbe Stadium in Sharpeville, because the victims of the struggle had to be acknowledged, and they had to know that their struggle was not in vain. So what did we do with that past? Any one of you that would revisit the George Tabbe Stadium would not even find a plaque at that stadium today. It's a soccer stadium. Why the Constitution was signed there, and in fact that it was signed there. So the table was set at that moment to link the past and the future, to restore dignity and to acknowledge the past and acknowledge the ones that had suffered from it. That is the link. So there are three brief comments I'd like to make. In following up on my earlier statement that we become the victim of our past. When you talk about democratic leadership, it is not strange now to find that political leadership venture into the operational field altogether, something that they wanted to cure in 1994 and 96, and then fell into that particular step as well. When you deal with governance, sound governance, open governance, transparent governance, you find that those who are supposed to be professional civil servants venture into the terrain of politics to curry favor with the politicians. And thirdly, the challenging question is access to justice. And I do believe in many ways we fall short, and it has to be unique in the South African context. It doesn't simply mean you have your day in court, so to speak, and therefore you have access to justice. Law, in a very innovative way in South Africa, has also got to be an instrument where old injustices are settled through mediation and by discussing and talking. And there has to be a finish line to these matters, of course, but it is much more than a legal framework. So the question I'm asking in the broader context of all of this is, I find myself in the company of William Butler Yeats, where he poses the question, will the center hold? Can the center hold when everything is falling apart? And I conclude by saying my hope is stronger than my disappointment as we speak, because at the moment, civil society is called upon to do its battles. And it becomes a battle of civil society versus the state to ensure that there is access to justice in the broader context that we are speaking about.
Thank you very much, Leon. So I'm going to go straight on to Sibusiso Ngubane. Join us in the front here. Paper, Role of Governance Oversight in Mitigating Against Institutional... sorry, reading the wrong one. I almost read your paper. Overcoming Constraints to Access Justice by the Missing Middle Population in South Africa. Sibusiso, over to you.
Hello. Thank you very much. I'm not sure if you can hear me.
We can perfectly well, so you are welcome to proceed.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm not sure if I'll be able to share my screen. If not, it's okay. Can you still see me?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so I'm also going to be a little bit brief. So I was actually looking at overcoming constraints to access justice by the missing middle population in South Africa. And the point of departure that I took here was to look at the perception towards access to justice. And there is a quote by Farrell that says, open quote, access to justice looks really different depending on who you are and where you come from, because so much of justice and so much of anything related to justice intersects with class, gender, race, language, education, culture, age, sexual orientation, poverty, homelessness, mental illness, and geography. And I thought of South Africa and the realities at this particular point in time, that the socio-economic status of the missing middle population, which of course refers to the majority of South Africans, is a hindrance to access to justice. So much so that they view access to justice as as something for the rich people, or for people who are in the privileged positions. And this was also even echoed by the South African Law Reform Commission, which of course was targeting the issue of the exorbitant prices of the legal fees. So which also places a burden over poor people to access justice. Now, I also further looked at the Constitution as a restitution towards this challenge, that yes, there are provisions with regards to the access to justice, but the Constitution sort of provides for the procedural aspect and not so much of the substantive, which means taking into account the capacity of individuals to get remedy or to get restitution through other means, or taking into account their sort of situation or their socioeconomic status. But this, of course, is linked to the legacy, the colonial legacy, as well as the apartheid legacy, which is still lingering today when it comes to economic status, when it comes to inequality. So this inequality that even permeates to legal fraternity, which also present a challenge when it comes to assisting those who do not have into accessing justice. And this, of course, impacts on the right to equality, human dignity, as well as the right to access to justice itself. But now, the interesting part is that the legal human rights frameworks international, regional, as well as, in the national human rights instruments, they do provide for the guaranteeing of actually right to access to justice. And this is done by ensuring the establishment of human rights institutions offering legal services for free, specializing in specific aspects of human rights such as CCMA, equality courts, as well as small claims courts, and many others. But the challenge now is these establishments, they are overburdened due to the main challenge, which is socioeconomic status and also even inequalities. So the budget constraints, the capacity to offer these services, it becomes even limited and the system becomes suffocated, which then does not serve everyone. And then people get discouraged in approaching these institutions, and it becomes even hard to sort of to stay on and to follow through with their grievances, and they just give up. Right. So these legal human frameworks, they sort of advance and sort of promote the equality. They also promote the access to justice, and also encourage other legal, alternative dispute resolution mechanisms to sort of alleviate the pressure from court. Now, the sort of the solution to this, of course, is to ensure that in these institutions such as Legal Aid SA, we increase the budget, because there is a budgetary issue when it comes to Legal Aid SA. We also increase their community outreach project. I'm glad and I'm happy to see that they are visible in mostly all social media platforms. And they are also sort of translating some of their content in some of the indigenous languages, which is, of course, it is their way of ensuring that the information reaches at the grassroots level. But still, there is a challenge, because the poor still don't have sort of access to these websites, to these phones, data, and so on. So the traditional way of community outreach, it still needs to be encouraged. And then the issue of the location of courts, as well as the structural accessibility for people living with disability, it's something that needs to be looked at, as human rights, legal human rights instruments, they do provide that. Now, the modern court or other modern tribunal offices, they need to be in line with the diversity of the people that we have in our society. And also to ensure that legal aid, for an example, they increase the capacity of the legal representation. One of the paper actually that was written by Leslie from UKZN, where students were actually researching about access to justice, they discovered that the legal aid is overburdened, so much so that some of the candidate attorneys, or some of the attorneys, they deal with almost 30 cases a day, and sometimes they just go to court to just postpone those cases. So the delay in actually getting an outcome is also a hindrance in access to justice. So that needs also to actually change. So lastly, my desire personally is to try and sort of contribute by sort of publishing some pamphlet in, of course, my indigenous language, defining access to justice, outlining basic human rights and available avenues to seek actually justice, and make sure that we create some sort of programs, school outreach programs, where we can go to schools and present this information in person, and also hand out these particular pamphlets. And also, we need to make the issue of access to justice a societal issue, meaning that even individuals themselves, they need to take initiative in learning or rather increasing and expanding their legal literacy, so as to know their human rights and to know if their human rights are violated, which route to actually take in order for them to get the remedies. And then human rights institutions, they need also to create the sort of a mechanism to evaluate and measure the success and to measure the progress they are making in ensuring that the services they are providing to increase access to justice, they are actually working, and also to target the well-documented issues such as budget, capacity, human rights capacity, and also the issue of caseload. So in conclusion, the NGOs, they must also take part. As teachers in schools, they must also take part. So it should not be something that is about lawyers or it's something about academia, but it must be everyone, everywhere we go. We need to talk about access to justice, understanding of our human rights, as well as knowing which avenues to take to actually access justice. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sibusiso.
Thank you.
Right now, Mihloti, we go to you. Mihloti Masuluke. I put an extra L in there. That's going to talk to us about the role of governance oversight in mitigating against institutional disruptions, SOEs, in South Africa. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Prof, and thank you to the colleagues that are joining. There is a presentation that we're going to assist me in projecting. It is a brief presentation, but I will not be able to look into it. I'm quite excited, Prof, that I come in after the plenary session that started initially, and the plenary session would have covered quite a number of processes in terms of the actions, what we need to do, strategies, plans. But if at the point of accountability and governance, we don't get it right, it is going to be a useless platform wherever we are trying to do. So my paper is basically one of 3 papers. I'm a PhD student at GIBS, and I'm looking at the phenomenon of state capture, but looking at the point in which it disrupted institutions. So I'm using the institutional theory that perceives institutions to be quite very solid, structured, and governed by laws. But we found that they have been disrupted by the state capture. And this is all based on the basis of the weak governance system. So we looked into that. I will continue while they're still trying to put together that. And one of the reasons we studied South Africa is because we're evolving from an apartheid era. And in that era, we had governance processes that were not necessarily geared at looking at what we currently have in terms of the problems that we faced ourselves with. We came in with, and I'll give an example because I studied the SOEs. If you look at the Eskom, I'm using Eskom on the basis of the rolling blackouts that are being experienced today. If you look at Eskom, the mandate of Eskom is clear, is to provide cheap electricity. Overnight, Eskom was faced with the responsibility of looking at unemployment, for instance. And that was not, they were not geared at servicing or at providing that particular service. And that is why we therefore decided to then look into this particular area to see where are we getting it wrong for us to be able to have a proper, strong governance processes, more especially on the basis that the theory perceives institutions to be governed by rules, by laws, what basically is the issue. So if you can go into the next slide. One of the things that also we have been able to pick up, Prof, is that the theory talks to formal institutions. It has not taken into consideration the informal institutions, and there is a lot of issues that are made up of informal institutions that dictate how the formal institutions are supposed to operate. But we also found out in the study that the shareholders, who are the voters, who are the main shareholders of these state entities, are not necessarily coming into the party in terms of what needs to happen, how to come up with the plan of action. So they are disregarded. And we have picked it up in the form of the fact that you have boards that are appointed, and the main stakeholders, who are the voters, are not necessarily involved in that particular process. And we believe that there should be some kind of a coexistence between formal institutions and informal institutions so that we can have accountability and good governance. I did indicate that we looked at the South African aspect on the basis of the raise of the state capture that came up. If you can move into the next slide, move into the slide that is talking to data method. It has a picture of a green picture. So what we did with our data, we basically collected data from people that would have been implicated in state capture, either as ministers, as board members, or as chief executives. We also looked at analysts that will be reporting on the issue of state capture. We looked at investigative journalists. We looked at the labor unions, because these things were happening in their presence, and that was our primary data. We basically would have interviewed those that would have appeared in the State Capture Commission to basically find out where did we miss out, because members of parliament are basically responsible for the governance aspect, and we wanted to get into that story and find out. The next slide. The next slide just depicts how we understand the governance framework as studied. So we do see state-owned entities. We see all three arms of government, but you see the voters as the main shareholders. The principal agency theory says that the public representatives are basically there to represent the voters, but the voters are basically found, more especially when it is time to be complaining, and they are not really responsible. And we have seen weakened judiciary, we have seen weakened institutions. So our findings is the next slide. Our findings, as I indicated, that there is a process of, at the informal level, the party discipline and loyalists who are not necessarily assisting in the formal institution, and there is a need for us, because we're finding people that get to be deployed through the cadre deployment of the governing party that may not necessarily be assisting the process in terms of governance. And we will give an example here that you have a situation, the study, the paper found out that you have a situation where the minister is responsible for appointing the board, and he also then, or she also appoints the chief executive. And that is as guided by the Public Finance Management Act, which says the minister has to appoint the chief executive. The Company Act says the board must appoint the chief executive. So there is a lot of ambiguity around that. But in a situation where the minister appoints the board and appoints the chief executive, and they both account to the minister then is supposed to account in the National Assembly to the portfolio chairperson. And when you go into that platform, the minister is normally higher in terms of political party structures. It's senior than the person that they are supposed to account to, which is the chairperson of the political party. Even prior to them going into the platform of accounting, they sit in a pre-meeting, which is called a caucus of a political party, where the person who accounts and the person who is supposed to be holding the executive accountable are part of that particular process. And you already are basically missing out and weakening the whole entire governance process, because then they deliberate on how they are going to have to deal with that particular moment, a particular issue. We have seen through the study, through the data that we collected, that there are a number of questionable decisions that would have been taken by ministers. There are a number of people that would have been appointed as chief executives that took questionable decisions that are making us find ourselves where we are. The next slide. And one of the problems that we're finding ourselves in is the single party dominance that I've already indicated, that you have a single party dominance where you find that this is the process where the chairperson and the person who accounts are from the same political party. And that also has, and we have an example, and I think if you're South African, you would know about the Esidimeni case, where in that particular challenge, you had a member of the DA, who was the official opposition, outlining the challenges that will happen. But because of the single party dominance, that matter never, it ended up as traumatic as we have, where today we still have people that will not be accounted for. And what then attracted or provided the gateway to state capture would have been the cash injections, the bailouts that would have been put in, the infrastructure, capital that would have been invested into all these SOEs have also contributed. But we also, Prof, picking up that the alternatives that are there in terms of, if you look at the fact that a person who is middle class can go in and have private security in their own household. They can get a medical aid, which is a failure of the public health system, the failure of the SAPS. And you can even get solar or a generator in a failure. It's a failure of the state. But because they have an alternative, they are not interested in participating. And that is our submission to say, we need the middle class to be part of this particular public affairs, because they will then inspire those that are below the living levels. And we also again emphasize the need for coexistence between the formal and the informal institutions. We believe that the electoral reforms that are coming up now based on the June 20 judgment on the electoral arena will assist in terms of addressing the single party dominant. But lastly, Prof, we believe that the restorative justice can only be achieved through collective restitution. And we conclude and contend that governance and democracy is a modern concept in our own, and it cannot be dealt with by us not looking at a modern approach to addressing this particular aspect. Thank you, Prof.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We will directly go to Jackie. So I'm going to call Jackie up to the front. Right, so Jackie Nachtigal, while we're getting her slides up, we'll be talking to a paper on legal expense insurance, a sustainable pathway to access to justice. Jackie, over to you.
Thank you, Prof. It's so interesting, your remarks on the middle class, because what I will discuss today, and I think what came out from the earlier sessions is as well, the incredible disparities. And I'm going to talk about access to justice, and access to justice specifically for the missing middle, those that fall beyond the legal aids means test and that are not able to afford legal services. So for the sake of brevity, just to frame it in context of restitution. So to my mind, restitution is to restore, which is to bring a system back into equilibrium. And I believe that the law is the most important process through which restitution can take place. Yet in South Africa, we remain challenged by the asymmetries in the justice system. Without equal participation, can restitution take effect for those who need it most, those who remain voiceless and powerless within the system? So the figures are staggering. We all know, it's well published, that 5.1 billion people in the world have unmet justice needs. In South Africa, 50% of South Africans have legal problems, and only 69% of those represent themselves in court, because only 18% can fall within the means test. So we're looking at the vast majority of South Africans that do not have access to basic legal services. So the barriers to access to justice is obviously very layered and it's deeply complex. To activate change, we need to augment our approach to the system. So critical to doing that is obviously understanding it and doing more research in alternative avenues of providing justice so that we can use data to make informed decisions that actually create change, that we don't keep on doing the same thing poorly over and over and over again. We are also challenged to move towards a people-centered approach to justice, which places people and their needs at the core. This requires a deep consultative understanding of the challenges people face and the context with which they face them in. This knowledge, in turn, informs appropriate and innovative solutions that are inclusive and impactful. And I believe in this manner, we can bring restitution to the legal system. So like I said, the current gap won't be solved by doing more of the same. So this brought me to do some research in legal expense insurance as an alternative practical solution to the access to justice gap. I use the Hague Institute of Innovation and what they call game-changing justice as the framework for this paper, which I co-wrote with Yvonne Jooste from the University of, from Wits, and Themba Mahleka from Peace Finders for Justice in New York. And we tried to use the people-centered approach and looked at the industry's challenges, and we did a research survey of 3,500 policyholders to test how they experience justice with legal expense insurance. So basically, just for everyone in the room, what is legal expense insurance? Oh, the slides are up. You can go forward. You can go forward, grab, forward. So just this gives us a brief overview of legal expense insurance. Now, interestingly, legal expense insurance is often relegated to a footnote in research. The South African Law Reform Commission did make some mention of it, but it is terribly underexplored as a model of providing access to justice for the missing middle. It dates back to the 1980s, developing locally in parallel to the transition of South Africa as we moved into a constitutional democracy. And typically, a legal expense insurer has in-house legal professionals who are not regulated by the Legal Practice Act. They provide in-house legal services in the form of mediation, legal advice, and basic drafting. The litigation component of legal expense insurance is paid out as an insurance claim, and that very much like medical aid, like we understand medical aid. But the power of the in-house legal expense legal professionals that work within these institutions are very under-researched in advice that they give, especially the alternative dispute resolution mechanisms that they use, which alleviates the court backlogs tremendously. So by last study, which was in 2013, it was estimated that 3.2 million South Africans have legal expense insurance policies. There are about 20 providers in South Africa with an average premium of 170. They tend to start at about 50, going up to 300. But staggeringly is to see the reported premiums from this industry. Collectively, they write premiums of 1.6 billion rand. This was in 2021, as reported to the Prudential Authority. And they paid out 480 million in claims. Now, the assumption is that these claims have all gone to legal practitioners that do litigation work for them. You can go to the next one. So we then did a study on the 3,500 policyholders, and the majority of these you will see fall beyond the legal aid means test, meaning they earn over 7,400 rand, 80% of them. 65% fall within the age bracket of 35 to 55, and it's a pretty equal gender split among these policyholders. You can go to the next one. On the question of why they take it, which is interesting, is it is very proactive to protect themselves and their family, to enforce their rights, to take control of their future, which poses very well for the future of the justice system. If people start proactively enforcing their rights, and it will prevent possible future disputes from growing. And then you can go on to the next one. And from a people-centered perspective, 82% of these policyholders said they were very or extremely satisfied with the services they received from the in-house legal professionals that they were dealing with. And 93% said they believe that their policy gave them access to justice. You can move on. Then obviously in the paper that we wrote, we discuss in quite a lot of detail, which we don't have time to today, the challenges that the industry faces, the educational barriers and the policy terms and how people understand them, the quality of legal services, especially because these legal professionals are unregulated. They are not part of the Legal Practice Council. We look at the regulation of legal services because the industry is mostly regulated by the insurance industry and not by the legal industry. Then we look at the complexity of free choice of lawyer and the trust that people have in insurance. And then lastly, the challenges on collaboration between the industry. How do you get the insurance industry and the legal fraternity to hold hands? This is specifically interesting because if you look at the jurisdictions, especially in Europe, legal expense insurance is way more advanced and mature than locally. And there are wonderful case studies, especially from Switzerland and Belgium, where legal aid and legal expense insurance have held hands together, and through a marriage and collaboration, they've been able to really enhance access to justice in the country and take the pressure off legal aid in their countries. You can go on. We obviously then also look at some of the benefits that it presents, the affordability, efficient services, the alignment of the asymmetries, the promotion of ADR, the prevention and proactivity that it presents within the legal system, and how it answers to the question of the missing middle. You can go on. So lastly, to bring back to the idea of game-changing justice, HIL, which is the Hague Institute for Innovation Law, they say we can't rely solely on governments to fix our problems. The problems have become too big. And in South Africa, with the extra challenges our government faces, the budgets on justice and the funding for access to justice is declining, not just in South Africa, globally, but especially in South Africa. So we need to look at alternative solutions that would close the gap. And they hold these elements as elements of game-changing justice. And we then ask the question of whether legal expense insurance does provide a game-changing avenue to justice, not a panacea for all justice problems, but a possible pathway that could alleviate it. Because legal expense insurance is a for-profit business. It is from the private sector. It has commercially sound structures in line with general principles of insurance, with a sound regulatory framework, and that ensures financial stability and safety. And it's not a cost burden on society or the government. It then provides people-centered justice with relatively high levels of satisfaction, as found in the study. It contributes to the economy and presents a 1.8 billion rand industry in South Africa. It is uncertain how many people it employs, but if we have 20 providers with a host of in-house legal professional, it also answers the question of legal graduates that have nowhere to go and can't get placements for articles. And it offers scalable justice service through, but although data is needed to ascertain the extent of the impact that it is. So we call for further research into it to explore how it can be augmented to really provide more to the people of South Africa. Obviously, access to justice in South Africa is a topic that requires urgent attention. All avenues to address the justice needs of South Africa should be thoroughly reviewed to help further legal agency and empowerment. This should be done in collaboration between various industries and bodies to develop these pathways. We don't suggest that legal expense insurance can solve all the problems, but it can definitely contribute it. And I, lastly, in closing, just want to say, for restitution to fully take shape, we need to ensure that every South African has equal access to the law so that they can use it as a leveraging tool to secure their other rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jackie. Now we're going to go to our guests from the beautiful city of Freiburg, University of Freiburg, Ertuğrul Çelik and Melina Hanhart is joining us online. Let's just, there we go. Can you hear us?
Yes.
Yes, perfect.
Excellent. Excellent. So, Ertuğrul, I think that you will probably go first, and we will hand the floor over to you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation. And we are really honored and delighted to be a part of this conference. Yeah, I and Melina will be presenting together, and I'll start first. We are not law experts. We are poor sociologists and social scientists, and I'm hoping that our contribution in that sense will be satisfactory, adding to lots of South African cases, issues, something from the other part of the Atlantic, but very much connected with the history of the South, global South in general. Let me start with how to connect our paper with the keynote addresses and plenary sessions this morning, and also with the framing of my colleague, the facilitator and the research person. So Mr. Wessels said at the beginning that my hope is stronger than my disappointment. So as you see in our title, I'm hoping that the PowerPoint presentation will accompany us. Yeah, as you see in our title, we also refer to this hope among the Chilean population, and we would like to stress that. Secondly, the Chilean case exemplifies a history of a legalized injustice. So in connection with one of the plenary sessions. And we would like to explore and indicate how the Chilean citizens, social movements, indigenous groups attempt to change this into a history of a legalized justice. Thirdly, the law is mentioned as a conservative tool or way to reach social justice and how we can use it effectively for restitution. I would like to also state that a change in the constitutional level can also be regarded as a kind of passive revolution. And related to this, our case refers to the point that people have been a full part of the quest for social justice and restitution through drafting a new constitution. So if we go to the first slide, I would just from the beginning would like to give you, please next slide. I would just like to talk about the chronological developments in the last 2-3 years. Okay, I'm hoping that the slide will move forward. In 2019, there was a social outburst, basically. So an outbreak of the, yes, thank you. An outbreak of the Estallido Social. So this is the social outburst, a kind of explosion, social explosion in that sense. And then the biggest march in the recent Chilean history happened in the capital city. Around 1 million people from different parts of the society, different groups, students, farmers, indigenous people, women, and so on and so forth. And then actually they ask for, requested for social justice in that sense through a new constitution. And a referendum took place and approved, and the drafting of the new constitution started. One of the most important things is the election of constitutional convention. So we will talk about this. It is very specific and inclusive. So all the people joined in the social movements during 2019 and 20 and the next years. So they all were represented in this constitutional convention. The drafting process started. In between, there was a presidential election, of course, and the leader of the student movement elected president in between. Then the draft constitution was finalized. A referendum took place in last September, just a month ago, and the draft is firstly rejected. So I would like to mention that anything that we say on why it is rejected will be speculative. So we need to a proper research to understand that. But we can still discuss this. Okay, the next slide, please. So why to call a new constitution, drafting a new constitution is a lot to do with the constitution from the existing constitution from 1980. So it carries the legacy from the military dictatorship and the Pinochet, as you most probably know very well. And this is written by a group of proponents of the dictatorship, clearly, and based on neoliberal economic principles. And there wasn't any democratic ratification, and there was also a plebiscite. It means that all the decisions taken try to ensure no return to the past in that sense, keeping this constitution with the legacy of military dictatorship securely. Okay, the next one, please. This is very important. We're talking about, next slide, neoliberal policies. So actually manufactured by Chicago boys from the Chicago School of Economics. Many of them became ministers during the Pinochet rule for many years, and still their relatives, children, and taking very important positions in the state. I mean, this was until the presidential election. Yeah, why neoliberalism so crucial in our sense, and why it has to do with restitution, social justice. It is very much important in the Chilean case because it has a lot to do with land dispossessions, for example, and privatization regarding the indigenous population. Not only, and also small farmers, expansion of mining. I mean, the neoliberalization of natural resources, especially water, is very much connected to expansion of mining and export agriculture. So accumulation of water rights was basically a part of also this neoliberal economic policies. So these were the foundations for the constitution. So please, next slide, and then we go more in detail. And this is Melina's part.
Thank you, Edgemond. Yeah, so I will now talk about the social movements that went on the streets during the Estallido Social, the social explosion, because many people went on the streets for very different reasons. For example, for protesting the private pension system, the private healthcare system, the educational system. But yeah, as Edgemond said, the demands were all united in the demand for a new constitution. And among the strongest and most influential movements were the feminist, environmental, and indigenous movements. And under the motto, "Never again without us women," the feminist movement demanded gender parity in the Constitutional Convention that would write a new constitution, but also sexual and reproductive rights in the new constitutional text and the recognition of care work. Next slide, please. And also the environmental movement took a very important role and protested mainly against Chile's neoliberal economic extractivist model, which bases heavily on the exploitation of natural resources. And yeah, along with this, as Edgemond already said, water issues became very important because as a substitutive legal document to the Constitution, the Water Code declared water as both a common good, but also as an economic good. And this allowed water to be traded as a commodity, basically. And yeah, generally it was demanded that the new constitution would redefine the human-nature relation, recognize the climate crisis, and also include rights of the nature. And next slide, please. A very central part in this dynamic also took the indigenous movement in the demand for a constitution, because the current constitution from 1980 does not recognize the indigenous population in Chile, so they're not mentioned at all as if they weren't existing. This makes Chile as one of the last countries in Latin America to not have manifested indigenous rights in their constitution. And yeah, a demand was the recognition of the indigenous population, but also to manifest Chile as a plurinational and intercultural state. And a great achievement was that Elisa Loncon, which is a Mapuche woman, the Mapuche are the largest indigenous group in Chile, became later the first president of the Constitutional Convention. And next slide, please. So now talking about the Constitutional Convention that drafted the Constitution, you can see that there were 154 people representing the electorate. Initially it was 155, but one person resigned. And yeah, what is truly unique and historic is the composition as an institutional body, because there was gender parity in the convention. Also 17 seats were reserved for the indigenous population. We had an indigenous female president. And further, the majority of the delegates of this convention were independent and not affiliated with a political party. That made up 64%. And yeah, many of these independent delegates were part of the social movements who protested during the Estallido Social, with a high representation of environmental, indigenous, and feminist movements. And yeah, it was a very diverse body that drafted this constitution. And okay, next slide, please. After 1 year, this group came up with a proposal of a constitution consisting of 388 articles and 11 chapters, which makes it one of the longest constitutions proposed worldwide, and maybe the most progressive regarding social rights. It entails many different social rights, including the demands from the feminist, environmental, and indigenous movements. It really does declare Chile as an ecological state, as a plurinational state, in guaranteeing indigenous rights and autonomy, enshrining natural resources as non-appropriable, so that there cannot be ownership over them, like in opposition to the current constitution. And yeah, it's important to mention that the proposal of this constitution was rejected last month in a referendum. And yeah, there are many different factors, and unfortunately we don't have time to discuss that. But despite this result, we argue that this constitutional process has been a quest for social justice and restitution, and continues and remains present in Chile. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much. Right, so we have a little bit of time for questions and discussion. We started late, so I'm going to allow a little bit of time. Before I invite questions and comments, allow me to abuse my position as the facilitator to ask a question that I think many in the room might be very keen to hear, and that's to ask our two colleagues online to just tell us what happens now in this story in Chile. It's a little bit like a cliffhanger, and I'm very curious to hear in terms of the process. So the referendum has just rejected the document. What is the next step?
Yeah, so right after the rejection of the proposal, there were discussions about a new committee that would draft a new proposal. And yeah, so discussions of creating a new constitution are still ongoing. And also part of the rejection campaign was, okay, we want a new constitution, but not this one. So yeah, discussions are ongoing, but it is right now up to the moment unclear who is going to draft this constitution. Probably it's not going to be civil societal actors again, because this was one of the main critiques, that it was not experts, but people from across civil society, not politicians or constitutional experts. So yeah, probably the new committee is going to be very different as an institutional body.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm going to open the floor for a few questions and comments before we break for coffee. Any questions from the floor? And please, not everyone at once. Okay, let me then again ask a question from the chair. So as I was listening, Jackie, especially to you, I was wondering whether Sibusise, Mhloti, and your papers weren't talking to each other on a very particular level. And I was wondering whether Sibusise said or raised specifically budget issues in relation to legal aid, really making the claim that, and Sibusise, you must please correct me if I'm misrepresenting you, but my understanding was of your argument that there's a real failure on the part of the state to adequately provide legal aid. Part of that failure is a budgetary failure. So there's just not enough money to keep these public institutions going to provide access to justice, right? So I understood that to be a core part of your argument.
Correct. But
Mhloti then,
sorry.
Please go ahead.
Yes.
Please go
But additionally, I also feel the issue of the administrative processes within the legal aid, that they do sort of play a role, in terms of the shortage of fund or the overusing or the sort of overusing the funds, basically. So yeah.
Excellent. And I think that even plays into my thought process even more, because it is then a broader kind of failure on the part of those institutions. Mhloti then raised the point in relation to SOEs and service delivery failures, that one of the things that's happened in South Africa is that the middle class is really buying themselves out of these failures of the state. And you use examples of medical aid and security and even now energy. And Jackie, then you came in and you suggested legal insurance as a solution. And I'm wondering whether there's a tension there between these three papers. Is the solution of legal insurance then not simply just another example of the South African middle class buying themselves out of the failures that Sibusise has highlighted to us? And is that not a problem? And I'm asking, I don't know whether these things are connected, but it seemed to me. So let's just get a mic to you. I'm going to bring you my mic.
I definitely think they are deeply connected, and absolutely, I do agree with you 1,000% that the middle class are buying themselves out of the failure of some of our institutions. What I suggest, or what I think is the better approach, is if we look at SDG 17 that calls for better collaboration. The government and the administration as it stands right now is not providing justice to all South Africans. Legal expense insurance currently provides legal expense or access to the missing middle. What would happen if the Legal Practice Council, Legal Aid South Africa, and the government Department of Justice and Constitutional Development and the legal expense insurance came together into one room and learned from one another and solved the problem in that way? But everyone is in isolated pathways to trying to solve something, and they're solving it ineffectively. So I do believe through the collaboration we can unlock something more. Like I mentioned, the case of Switzerland, for instance, they had a model where they subsidized legal expense insurance policy for all of their citizens to lessen the burden on the legal aid system, so that, as Sibusiso rightly said, they are sitting with 30 cases that come up on a day, so that it alleviates the pressure on those systems, so that the justice provided through those systems can be better. So I think it's through collaboration.
Right, so let me then throw in there to our other two speakers. Do you want to perhaps venture a view? Do you think this idea of a public-private partnership, let me put words in Jackie's mouth, can be a model? So let me then ask the other two speakers, do you think that this idea of a public-private partnership could be a potential route to solving some of the issues that you raised? Because I think between the two of you, you very neatly raised the access to justice and the governance issues that are both prevalent in this example. And in your answers, may I also ask then to connect that to our two Freiburg speakers, whether that's not too much of a new liberal approach to solving public problems. So, Sibusiso, let's go to you first, and then Msloti, we'll go to you.
You are muted, Mr. Ngubane.
Okay, sorry about that. No, I'm saying that I actually have a question, I think, to Jackie, with regard to the private offering of, or to alleviate the pressure of the legal aid. In terms of the limitations, are there any limitations in terms of the type of cases, or in terms of the services that is offered? And will the sort of the fees withstand the pressure? For an example, if you sort of saying that this is similar to medical aid. So medical aid, you have access. Sometimes some of medical complications are not covered. So with regard to this specifically, will actually be able to cover everything? Or, I mean, it's a comprehensive cover, or there are limitations in there? And then secondly, I also, in terms of alleviating the pressure, I think most of the solutions, they evolve, or they revolve around funding, because legal aid, they do also outsource their services. And I think they have something along the lines of educare. So that also still is a challenge, because the claims from the private lawyers is also exorbitant, so which also milk the funds. So it's all revolve around the funds. And I think the solution really needs to go in there as to how then can they best distribute, or how they can then best spend the funds, the funding, while also ensuring that the legal representation offered is of quality and is enough.
Thank you. I think, Prof, I would agree with the last statement of Sibusiso in terms of the fact that we have seen a lot of cash injections done across a number of sectors. And I think a proposal to have additional funding coming in here is not going to assist, because state capture is about personally enriching yourself. So somebody, a shadow state, is going to be sitting somewhere and looking at voids of how they can get themselves into that. So whatever approach we come up with, we will still continue to find somebody who is looking at the voids and the weaknesses of how they can be able to come in there. I think we have, as a country, tried to look into the issue of the public-private partnerships. And we are sitting here today discussing this issue of restitution because it has not worked. And we are not saying that we can just throw away those ideas, because we're having the best constitution, we've had good strategies. But what we can say, and that is the missing link, what we are trying to sponsor, is to say, how do we then get the main shareholders to be part of this. So if you continue to have the private-public partnerships, how do you then create some kind of a buffer structure that is not interested in anything but to see restitution coming in? So if we come in and we say that in this public-private partnership, when we inject cash, we're going to have a particular percentage coming from the academia, from the public, that will be basically sitting in and ensuring that there is accountability. And that is what we are contending in terms of how we can be able to deal with, because I will indicate, Prof, that when we look at where we're coming from as a country and we look at transformation, when the former President Mbeki said in the recent funeral of the Jesse Duarte, who was the deputy secretary of the ANC, in that memorial service, the former president indicated that we, as the ANC, has all the plans that they ever had for transformation has not worked. We're talking 2 decades into democracy. And that is why we still believe that there is nothing that will assist us if we come up with strategies, with plans, with good policies, unless we do have the middle class coming into the party. And we are sponsoring that. Thank you, Prof.
Hi, thanks. I guess where my interest is from the Chilean example is they have gone through a neoliberal, probably fascist type of ruling led by the Chicago school, as you say, the Chicago boys. And you realize the errors there and you've started again with the kind of failures that you've had. And in South Africa, we've gone through the same kind of process where we've got a wonderful constitution, as you say, but the key elements that we're missing in this country has been the title of this presentation, Public Governance, Democratic Leadership. We've kind of skipped that. So we have a party-elected list of people, and you've pointed out the problems in the running of Eskom and others, right? We still have a very neoliberal type of philosophy. Those of us who can afford it, go to private sector providers for whatever it is that we want. Those who can't afford it are really jammed. They're stuck, right? And increasingly, even the example given by Jackie of legal expense insurance, lots and lots of people are taking advantage of that because they want a solution. Whatever the solution is, they want a solution, right? You're doing it in housing too. Even people who have RTP housing are giving up on those things, right? So I think, I mean, one of our problems is this, in this country at least, is this lack of what I call social cohesion, right? But it's expressed by this, we've got the worst inequalities in the world, all right? I think we're as close to Brazil in terms of our income inequalities, right? Probably even first, and Brazil is after us. So when you look at the data, then you'll see that actually we all have hope, as Leon said, but hope is fading. Hope is fading. If more than half of our population is youth, and most of them are unemployed, and we've got the data. The data is all around, right? What hope are we giving those people who are going to be the next generation to come? Right? We can't always privatize the service delivery side of our life, right? But we have. I mean, recently the presidency has changed the Ethics Act or something, right, to allow certain additional things to happen, right? Now, so you'll have people who earn a lot, who don't pay for electricity, and people who earn very little, almost nothing, are facing increasing costs, right? It's a recipe for disaster. You know? So I think when we look at access to justice, it is that entire complexity, the governance, the leadership, and access, because that actually causes the consequent problems of access to justice. You know, I think I'll stop there.
I think a very important just point to pick up from what you've just said is that access to justice, and I think this directly picks up on the Chilean example as well, because you noted all the socioeconomic rights that you've got in that text, even though that's the one that's not accepted. But I mean, I think what we're seeing in South Africa is all good and well having all the wonderful rights in your constitution, but then you struggle to get access to justice in a meaningful, substantive way, meaning you can get access to the mechanisms to make it real, and then after that, something happens. It becomes real. And I think those two things, and right early on, one of the contributors mentioned the need for real substantive access. I think it was CCU who made that point about formal access is not good enough. And I think that's really what you're referring to. And then having a very progressive constitution becomes a cocktail for disaster because people lose faith in the system. There's a document that promises me a lot of things, but in reality, I can't get, because firstly, there's this hurdle of getting access to the formal mechanisms. And even if I'm so lucky to get access to the formal mechanisms, it's not made real. And I think that is a big concern, and one should think about all of that. Right. I'm going to allow two more, and then we're going to have a conclusion.
Thank you very much, Prof. And thanks to all presenters. I think having listened since the morning, and I think that's something that's going to go on even tomorrow, there's a thread that seems to be coming through all discussions on restitution, including now on public governance, democratic leadership, and access to justice. And I know that a number of presenters, Mihloti said the middle class, I think Jackie and Spusi, so in a way talking about the missing middle, which is just below the middle class, I think what we should appreciate is that even the middle class cannot buy itself out forever. It's not sustainable, and that it is in the best interest of the middle class to inspire more confidence by standing up, and leading the charge against the injustices that are currently taking place in the country. Because, when in the Ndlulamiti scenario, talk about the Gwara state, that's where you just close yourself in the house. You can't even go out. But the reality is that, the saying that the poor will eat, the rich, could be a possibility. And I think that's why I'm saying the sooner we get to realize that even those who may be considered to be middle class, which in a way in the country is currently declining. It rose at a particular level, but it's declining. So this ability of collectivism, getting to understand that the middle class will not be able to just sustain itself, and that it will require for it even to be inspired, it needs those who are in the poorest of the poor to be lifted. So I think that's the justice that we should, or the social justice that we should also be looking at. So that, thank you.
Thank you. I think it's a point well made. So I'm going to go for a last comment. Then we're going to get a quick summary, and I'm going to give each of our panelists 1 minute final comment, so you can start thinking about your minute. Please go ahead, ma'am.
Thank you. The previous speaker basically just said the things that I wanted to say, because I was just looking at this whole concept of the middle class, that, as you define it, it's declining. It's declining. Even what you call the middle class, they're starting not to afford some of these things. And we are sitting on a ticking time bomb.
Sbusiso, I think it's Sbusiso that referred to the rate of unemployment amongst the youth. And, you know, when the youth is hungry, Professor Madonsela normally refers to it as it's hangry people. They are hungry and they are angry. And when that time bomb explodes, it doesn't matter whether you're middle class or whether you're wealthy. So it's something that we really need to look at.
Thank you very much. Kopano, can I ask you to sum up for us, please? And then I'm going to go around our panel and give everyone 1 minute final comment. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Prof. Can I take advantage and sum up with some questions?
You may.
Thank you very much, Prof. Dear colleagues, I'll just start quickly with the links that I found in Mrs. Busiso Ngubani's presentation, as well as Ma'am Masuluke. The important link was the link of empowering the populace, giving people knowledge. Once people know their rights, they know better, they act better. Prof. Madonsela has a quote that she says, when you know better, think better, feel better, you do better. So the link that I found in your presentations was the importance of empowering the populace with knowledge. Now, I will jump quickly to another link between Advocate Jackie and Sbusiso, Mr. Ngubani, sorry. Now, I found a bit of I really appreciate the fact that, Prof, you raised the tension in the presentations. And I appreciated Advocate Jackie's response to say that the solution is collaboration. This is my contention with that response. That when you presented the LEI as a new insurance, right? And Prof then retorted by saying that it's just another. In fact, Mr. Ngubani also said it's just another response, another insurance policy that insulates the middle class. This is my contention, that even if there is collaboration, the design or the structure of this solution is fundamentally problematic, because access to this solution requires that you can afford access. One of the reasons why there is a high number of cases at legal aid is not only because people that go to legal aid pass the means test, but also because there's a number of cases that should not even enter the doors of the courtroom. By this, I do not mean to nullify some cases. What I mean is that simple mediation or other alternative responses could really make access to that dispute resolution faster than going to a magistrate's court. So this is what I would propose, and I'm hoping that in your minute response, Mr. Ngubani and Advocate Jackie, think about this. That instead of proposing that a solution should be funding through an insurance policy, because unlike medical aid, which one could justify to say that there's always an impending danger of a need for medical intervention, when it comes to an impending need for legal intervention, the nature of the legal issue is material. It is material that sometimes the legal issue, like I said previously, can be resolved through mediation and would not require a magistrate. So ponder on this, that instead of proposing that there should only be funding, that was Mr. Ngubani, or that there should be a policy for funding, rather ponder on a kind of model that provides funding to cases that warrant the funding. If a case is of the nature that it can be simply resolved through a mediation or a consultative process that does not require the cost of an attorney, the appearance costs at the magistrate court, etc., 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 then those cases would be prioritized as ones that should deserve funding. And those people should not need to qualify for that funding, because the strength, the merits, yes, the merits of the case would warrant that this case should be discussed in a court of law. All right. And then before my minute is over, I just want to
Closer to 10, but okay.
Thank you, Prof. Before my minute is over, I just want to comment on our scholars from Germany and what they said about particularly Melina's presentation when she spoke about gender parity. And I would challenge that when you give your minute response, consider this, that yes, I appreciate your response that the constitution will then be rewritten and we're not sure who's going to rewrite it, but perhaps this discussion will be useful in some way or another. Consider this in your response, that advocating for gender parity by means of quotas or by means of inclusion does not always yield the outcomes that are wanted. Because falling under a specific gender categorization does not always yield a specific gender consciousness. This applies also to other forms of quotas, whether it's color or race, etc., putting people in positions simply on the basis of quotas does not always yield the desired outcome. What yields the desired outcome? Putting together the right requisite competencies and checks and balances. So consider that in your 1 minute response. And for the purposes of time, I'll close with the quotation that has been repeated many a times by Leon Wessels, which says, "My hope is greater than my disappointment." I picked up a lot of disappointment in the presentation by Ms. Masu Luke regarding the situation at Eskom, and I wish I had more time to discuss the presentation. But what I would say is that by virtue of being here means there is hope, and that hope should be stronger than the disappointment we've experienced. Thank you, Prof.
Thank you, Kupano. Right, so let 1 minute to our panelists each. Ertument, I'm going to start with you.
Okay, thank you very much. Melina just wrote me that her computer crashed. So I'll answer the question. It is a very provocative what our reporter has done. Thank you very much. The point is very shortly. The point is also about the women leadership. So it's not only about gender parity to make it safe under law and the new constitution, the draft constitution, because in all kinds of movements, let's say it's ecological movement in Chile, the leaders of the movement, many of them were indigenous women. So they were in the indigenous movement, but at the same time in the ecological movement, and particularly combined with the urban woman movement, feminist movement. So I would just say, please consider that not only as numbers 77 and 77, it is also the leadership of women that plays a big role. Secondly, what we'd like to mention in general is that, so I'm Turkish. So the Turkish history is very close to the Chilean and many other Latin American countries. So in the 70s, 80s, a similar type of military coups created also very repressive constitutions. So they are still in place. My point is that as a sociologist who is based in Germany but has done lots of research in the global south and basically in South Africa. I mean, South Africa is my second home. I would say that all the discussions going on, of course, definitely on the South African case itself, when it comes to social justice and restitution. But what I have been doing with my South African colleagues in the last years is to bring all these issues to a different level across the global south. So all these connections would help each other in an enormous way, I must say. That's why we're talking about Chile. That's why I can give another talk on the Turkish case. That's why we're focusing on Argentina and South Africa, trying to make a sociology across the south. I would also suggest for the whole conference and the reporters that please, for the next time, keep in mind how we can think all these, the South African issues in close relation to what happens somewhere else in the global South. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jackie, I'm going to come to you for your 1 minute.
Thanks, Prof. To answer you, I think we're at a space of learning, and that is why data collection, research is of critical importance. I do believe that funding cases that really need funding is an incredibly important part of the access to justice challenge. But unfortunately, access to justice is far more than just what we deem necessary to fight. The problem with legal aid South Africa is, unlike our public hospitals or public schools, they exclude people who earn over 7,400. Public hospitals don't make you do a means test and then say, sorry, we're not going to give you service. So in the legal sector, the middle class is forced to look for other alternatives, but they cannot afford the cost of attorneys, as we can see from a reading of the South African Law Reforms Commission into legal fees. So we have a particular problem in the legal sector and in buying, or in the legal economy, which is not entirely the same as in our other public spaces. But what we do need is thorough research to understand how paralegal community officers are working, how pro bono funding is working, how legal expense insurance is working, how Legal Aid South Africa is working, so that we can take the best learnings, collaborate, and provide solutions with impact. So that's my 1 minute.
Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Briefly, I think we can have the best policies, we can have the best strategies, the regulatory environment can be intact. But if we are weak at holding the executive accountable, those that are responsible for managing our fiscals, we are not getting it right. And it is at this moment that we are calling that there is a need that the shareholders understand that they own a stake in the public. And for them to be able to understand that, they will then be able to then come in and make sure that they hold the executives accountable. So we basically say that there's a need for a reform in terms of our current governance and oversight model. We need to include the shareholders in terms of the different categories. Thank you, Prof.
Thank you very much. Sibusiso, you've got your minute.
Thank you very much. I also want to actually agree to the last speaker about the civil society oversight. We need to get everyone involved, and also to look at the holistic approach. So the holistic approach, I think it's really do need to look at funding, but we also need to look at how we can actually reach the people down there at the bottom, those people in rural areas, those people in informal settlement, these people living with disability. How can we actually reach them and sort of give them legal literacy so as to know when to approach legal aid, and so as to know which necessary or sort of specific avenue they need to take for their grievances. And also the issue of privatization of public services, I think we also need to look at what these private companies are. Do they actually, as much as they do offer the services, but they are actually making money. So they're actually not going to be about a charity case. So whether or not your case is small or your case is major, you will still be charged, I think, a minimum or a standard fee, which of course still take away the money that you do not have. Whereas when we talk about legal aid, when we talk about the increasing or injecting funding to legal aid, we contribute to this tax. So you can imagine you are contributing towards tax, at the same time you are then going on and paying a private company to represent you. So that is also a challenge. And we also need to remember that legal aid, as much as it might look like a privilege because of their limitations, the means test, it is also a constitutional sort of provision as it's provided by Section 35. So we also need to look at specifically how they manage their affairs and how we can properly ensure that we sort of ease the pressure on them, but not necessarily that we can let them off the hook. And even themselves, they need to look at how they can increase their funding by approaching a private sector. And as I said, look at the holistic approach. Everyone, NGOs, they also need to come on board. Larger law firms or medium law firms, they need to come on board with their pro bono offerings, so that we ensure that the pressure on legal aid is not as much as it is now.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Sibusiso. I have to stop you there, unfortunately. Leon, you've literally got a minute to wrap it up.
Thank you so much. The average age of a written constitution is 17 and a half years. South African constitution is 26 years old. There is a provision that it can be revisited, and there are mechanisms how to amend it. It will mean absolutely nothing if we don't own the problem and don't own the solution. One of the best constitutions ever written, one of the best constitutions, which was the highlight of public participation, was the Thai constitution. It lasted 9 years, which means public participation necessarily does not result in an everlasting constitution. We have to own the problem and own the solution, and that requires ethic and moral leadership. The amendment of the Electoral Act is much more important than we think, because we'll have to live with that result for years to come if we get it wrong now.
Thank you very much. And please then join me in thanking all our speakers. That brings the session to a close. You'll have to very quickly get a cup of coffee if you want to have something to drink before the next session. Thanks.
Thank you, Sibusiso. Bye.
Hello, bye-bye. Thank you.
Hello and bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.